Hello, Greyhounds, and welcome back to our NTI book chats. This is episode 6, titled The Laws in Town, from the book How They Choked, and this is about Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton thought of the world as a big puzzle that he should solve. So while everybody else was minding their own business, making friends, and being loved by their families, Newton figured out why the sun and all the planets don't randomly float around and bang into each other, why the tides go in and out, and why a ball stays at rest until you kick it. He unscrambled things, gave them formulas, and turned them into laws. And he liked keeping them all to himself because he really hated to share, or maybe he was never taught how. His scientific findings prove his genius, but the other half of Newton's life marked him as a notable whack job. His decision to drop science and become a crime-fighting manhunter qualify Isaac Newton as one of the biggest puzzles of all time. Isaac Newton fell to earth in 1643. He didn't get his smarts by way of nurturing since his dad died before he was even born, and his mom abandoned him when he was only 3. She took off with a new husband and had 3 more kids someplace else while Newton was left with his grandmother on a farm only 7 miles away. Newton threatened to burn his mother's new family home down, and that sums up how he felt about that. Mom eventually came back with his 3 half-siblings after her second husband died, but then she sent Newton off to boarding school. He wasn't wanted by his mom, and you don't need to be a scientist to know that can ruin a person. So it's hard to know the answer to the riddle of which came first, Newton wanting to be left alone or Newton being left alone. At school, with no laws of socializing in his arsenal, Newton didn't play well with others, so he picked fights instead. When he wasn't fighting, he was copying books, word for word, in neat, weensy, 1/16 of an inch high handwriting. Who needed friends or family anyway? He learned to have his own good time. When school ended for Newton at 16, his mom demanded he come back home. Not because she missed him, because she wanted him to work on the family farm, herding sheep, managing the workers, and figuring out how much to charge for hay. If she'd known one iota about her son, she'd have known that on the list of jobs Newton shouldn't do, people manager and farmer were at the top. So there were no sad goodbyes 9 months later when he packed a pound of candles, some ink, and a chamber pot, which is a portable potty, and left for Trinity College at Cambridge University, a place where he would know more than anyone there could ever teach him. A couple of times during his college years, Newton was forced to go back to the farm. Up to 1,000 people a week were dropping like flies all over England because of the plague. Fleas sucked the blood of rats, then jumped onto people for more blood sucking. All this sucking spread the plague. Every public place was closed. Exiled back at the farm, there would be no more chores for Newton. He went off and did his own thing, even though no one knew what that actually was. Whether he was staring at the sun or at the night sky, his head was always in the clouds. And it wasn't as if Newton had a girlfriend to look at the moon with, or any buddies to spitball ideas around with. He didn't share anything with his family either, because he knew they couldn't care less. When he was finally able to return to Cambridge, he showed his math professor that he hadn't goofed off while school was closed for plague days. As a matter of fact, what Newton had done without input from anyone was so revolutionary, he had surpassed his professor by 100 light years. Eventually, the professor handed Newton the keys to the school, his professorship, and his lab. Newton was 27 years old. Later, his ex-professor took Newton's work to the Royal Society in London, which was basically the first science club. Members would do experiments and prove things to each other. This so-called scientific revolution was fueled by brilliant thinkers sharing information so that they could build on each other's ideas to reach the next big idea more quickly. 2 heads are better than 1. For example, it took more than one person to think of luggage with wheels. Someone thought up the wheel, and another person thought of the luggage part, and even that took a few thousand years. Anyway, people finally figured out that knowledge was power, and it was better when shared. Everyone except Newton. The Royal Society welcomed Newton into the club because they liked the way he proved his theory that the sun's white light wasn't an absence of color, but a combination of all the colors. Think of an invisible rainbow. One thing led to the next, and Newton, using this idea, added a little mirror to a telescope. That's how every telescope has been made ever since. Newton demonstrated his cool telescope for the society, but once there, Newton was reminded that he had already given up on people, and he didn't feel more loved or appreciated after divulging what he had figured out on his own. He was practically allergic to defending his hypothesis. He hated it when others would say, "Oh yeah, I thought of that too," and Newton didn't bother to answer any of their ding-dong questions. Really, he'd figured it out already. Newton escaped back to Cambridge without even telling them his best stuff, like calculus and his laws of gravity. He dragged his feet for a couple of decades before he divulged those. Several times, Newton would use another scientist's data, calculate a new formula, and make it a law, but he didn't acknowledge the other person's input. He liked the scientific world the way it already worked, in secrecy, every man for himself. He wouldn't share, and he wasn't interested in the day-to-day discoveries of the scientific revolution that he happened to be a big part of. Just when he should have been collaborating and expanding his thinking, he dove back into the science of the Middle Ages, abandoning his most precious commodity, his own mind. Maybe it was just a good excuse to get away from people, but the bizarre nature of his next obsession boggles even lesser minds. Or maybe it was just greed. Newton wanted to turn lead into gold, a process called alchemy. Also called witchcraft, magic, and pretend science, but there was one thing everybody called it: illegal. It was a get-rich-quick scheme of con men and counterfeiters. The Act Against Multipliers from the 1400s had outlawed the making of gold by alchemy, because then all the wrong people would get rich. On the sly, except for the billowing smoke and fumes emanating from his lab, Newton distilled, heated, and fermented concoctions of mercury, lead, and arsenic, attempting to make gold. And he didn't just dabble, he did it on and off for 25 years. Decades worth of recipes and over 1 million tiny squished words filled his papers with meticulously measured brews that he touched, tasted, and inhaled. While he scribbled and stirred, Newton's sharp mind grew foggy with symptoms of toxic lead and mercury poisoning, depression, anxiety, insomnia, loss of appetite, and memory, until he finally collapsed. Isaac Newton's brain was in a muddle. He was 50 years old. Something else in England had also collapsed: the monetary system. Almost 95% of the coins in circulation were counterfeit. Crooks melted silver and diluted it with lesser metals, which was a distant version of what Newton had been attempting for quite some time. Men caught defacing money were hanged, and women were burned at the stake. Luckily, Newton managed to keep his illegal obsession a secret, but it was no secret that he was the smartest man in England. So in 1696, he was asked to be warden of the mint, where all the money was made. Newton wasn't a joiner, and his sanity was at stake, but he still took the job at the Tower of London, a place of beheadings, imprisonments, and buildings with names like the Bloody Tower, in a city where 500,000 strangers were jammed together without plumbing. In London, his new home, the death rate exceeded the birth rate. The toxic and confirmed people-hater who had barely recovered from losing his marbles dusted off his limited people skills and his math abilities and showed up for work. Newton studied 200 years of England's accounts, organized assembly lines, created schedules for 500 workers and 50 horses, and recoined all the money in England in 2 years. Another puzzle solved. But there was more to Newton's job as warden of the mint: hunting down counterfeiters and enforcing the law. There wasn't anything to study or decode. Police didn't start keeping records of crimes or criminals until 1829. He had figured out the behavior of bodies in motion, but not that of living, breathing bodies in motion. The people puzzle still bewildered him, and he judged everybody the same way. He didn't like them. Talk to people? What use was that? With zero skills as a crime fighter and his laws of gravity, motion, and tides and all the rest far behind him now, Newton was the law. He was definitely the only member of the Royal Society who ever followed criminal leads, spied on people, and issued arrest warrants. And in Newtonian style, he started writing lots and lots of crazy notes. He also had to make friends in this job. They just happened to be thieves, extortionists, and thugs. He conspired with them to entrap counterfeiters and throw them in prison. Newgate, an overcrowded prison with a sewer running through it, had no beds and little food. It was a death sentence itself. More people died there waiting for trial than on the gallows. Newton grilled inmates, dragging men out of their cells and into the narrow hallways. Then he'd bribe and terrorize them until they confessed and signed testimonies. Being shackled in irons or being forced to squill by the greatest thinker of the time didn't make it any less awful. It was worse. Newton vented the rage he had for his fellow man in his scribbled, crossed-out, ink-blobbed rants. The distance between him and everyone else had been widened and confirmed. Hundreds of interrogations and 24 hangings later, Newton's 3.5-year reign as Warden of the Mint was over. Before moving on to his next job as Master of the Mint, he burned all of his interrogation records. In his entire life, these were the only papers he destroyed. Dark, invisible forces were raging inside Isaac Newton and in those papers, and he wanted to keep them a secret. On the outside, he appeared sane and in control, as can be seen in the more than 14 portraits he commissioned of himself during his time in London. But on the inside, he was a loveless man, a predictable outcome for the victim of a loveless life. He lacked in love, but he had plenty of money. As Master of the Mint, Newton received a percentage of every English pound England's money, like the US dollar, produced. He had finally found a way to make gold after all. He held that job until his death at 1727 at 84 years old. In 1872, his alchemy papers were offered as a gift to the Cambridge University Library by the descendants of Newton's half-niece, Catherine Barton, who had kept the papers after he died. But the university didn't want them. Later, John Maynard Keynes, the world-renowned economist, bought them. He said, "They have beyond doubt no substantial value whatever except as a fascinating sidelight on the mind of our greatest genius. He was the last of the magicians." In 1979, a lock of Newton's hair was analyzed. It contained large amounts of mercury as well as lead. High levels of lead are known to cause violent behavior. The two pieces of Isaac Newton's life don't fit together: the superstar scientist and philosopher, and the crime-fighting manhunter. We may never unravel the invisible laws that were working inside his mind and in his heart, or the riddle of why he tried to turn metal into gold for so many years of his life. But why he turned on his fellow man might be the easier piece to decipher. Like the Beatles' song title, "All You Need Is Love," and Isaac Newton never got any. Thank you guys for listening, and stay tuned for episode 7.